He did not move. He did not speak. But in that golden moment, with the sun casting long shadows across the stone, a soldier raised his hand in salute. Not to a flag, not to a monarch, to a child. A little girl in a faded pink dress, holding a letter in one hand, and a silence far too heavy for someone her age. Around them, the world kept walking. But one man stood still, because he had already been standing in the past for far too long. His name was Sergeant Edward Talmor, 38 years old, 15 years in uniform, 7 of them spent standing, without speaking. A royal guard, known for silence, trusted with tradition, but not many knew that before the silence, he was a combat medic in Helmand. That, before the posture, there was a war. That, before this stillness, there had been screams. He never flinched, not when tourists jeered, not when children shouted, not even when drunken laughter echoed through the courtyard at dusk. But that afternoon, something was different. His eyes, usually empty, blinked. Just once. A girl approached, no older than 7. Small hands, pale face, and a folded envelope pressed to her chest. Behind her, an old man in a worn beret, a veteran's coat, a photograph in his hand. The crowd didn't notice. They never do. But Edward noticed. Not the girl's dress, not the trembling, but something else. Something about the way she stood. Like she wasn't there to ask for anything. Like she came to deliver something he had forgotten. Something he thought had been buried, but wasn't. Before he wore red, he wore dust. Before medals, there were bandages. And before silence, there was a voice. Sergeant Edward Talmor wasn't born to be still. He was made still by a single choice, a single child, and a single scream that still echoes quietly beneath the buttons of his uniform. He had broken orders once. In the chaos of Helmand, they called it triage. Prioritize, move fast, follow the list. But the boy in the rubble wasn't on the list. Edward carried him anyway. Carried him through fire, through blood, through guilt. His unit never made it out. 1 life saved, 3 lost. He didn't wear shame, but it wore him. In the years that followed, Edward chose a new uniform. One that required no decisions, no split-second judgment, no mistakes. A role built on rules, on silence, on standing still. Because moving, even once, had cost too much. So he stood, for years, as if still waiting, for the boy to walk back out of the smoke, for the weight to lift. But it never did. Until now. Until Clara. She didn't run. She didn't smile. She simply stepped forward. One shoe slightly scuffed. One mitten clenched too tightly. Her posture was careful, but not out of fear. It was the posture of someone who knew they were entering sacred ground. Edward saw it. Not just the child, but the weight behind her movement. Children don't carry weight like that, unless it was given to them. And someone had, in her hand, a note. Old. Folded once, then folded again. The kind of fold made when you open something too often. She held it like a memory, not a message. Edward's gaze dropped, just slightly. A shift no tourist would notice. But he noticed it. So did the old man beside her. Arthur Finchley, former U.S. medic, former friend. Now, just a quiet witness. One hand on Clara's shoulder, the other clutching a photograph, black and white, curled at the edges. Time had worn it. Edward knew the face in the photo. Not from newspapers, not from history, from his own hands, from a battlefield, from a choice he never unmade. And now, that face had returned. Through her, most children come to Buckingham Palace, wide-eyed, laughing, pointing. Clara didn't. Her eyes were calm, not empty, just clear, as if she had already seen the world and was returning to say goodbye. She didn't speak, not because she couldn't, but because there was nothing left to prove. She knew where to stand, not too close, not too far, a respectful distance, like a soldier might. Edward noticed the stance. It was deliberate, intentional. He knew it. He'd trained it, but never in someone so small. Her beanie slipped slightly, revealing the curve of a bare scalp, a whisper of what she'd lost, but she didn't adjust it. She stood still, waiting, not for permission, but for a moment to be recognized. She wasn't there to be pitied. She didn't need rescue. She had come to honor something. And Edward, for the first time in years, wasn't sure if he was the guard or the guarded. The roles had shifted, subtly, quietly, but unmistakably. In the silence between them, she was already stronger than him. The wind softened. Even the pigeons seemed to wait. The square, once filled with footsteps and selfies, held its breath. Not because anyone understood, but because something had shifted. Children were hushed. Tourists looked up. The chatter faded. Phones lowered. Eyes turned. Not to the palace, not to the sky, but to the space between a soldier and a child. Edward could feel the stare. Hundreds of eyes, watching, waiting. But not one of them knew what this moment meant. Not really. Clara stood her ground, not asking, not pleading, just present. The note in her hand, creased, softened by time, the kind of paper that holds memory. Arthur's grip on the photo tightened. No words were exchanged. None were needed. But in Edward's chest, something tightened. Not muscle, not breath, memory, and the weight of it became unbearable. His feet remained still, but inside, he was already moving backwards, through smoke, through screaming, through the exact moment when silence had first begun to feel like safety or punishment. And now, in front of all these strangers, he was about to break it. The boy in the photograph had a name. Thomas, 10 years old, big eyes, broken wrist, and a quiet way of saying thank you, without words. Edward had carried him, not because he was ordered to, but because he couldn't walk away. Not again. In that burning field hospital, choices had come fast. Lives were listed, prioritized. But Thomas wasn't on the list. He was under it, buried in dust and screams. Edward had lifted him, alone, and in doing so, missed the blast. The one that took his unit. The one that took Arthur's grandson. The boy. Arthur had never forgiven himself for not reaching, and Edward had never forgiven himself for choosing the wrong child. But Clara wasn't Thomas's sister. She was his daughter, born 6 months after the war, raised on stories, fed on silence, and now carrying the letter her father never got to write. She had brought it here, not for a reunion, not for revenge, but for something harder, for release, for peace, for the kind of ending that begins in silence and finishes with a salute. She stood there, like he used to, still, straight, quiet. But her quiet wasn't learned. It was inherited. The weight in her shoulders wasn't from age. It was grief, passed down, folded into bedtime stories, pressed between the lines of absence. Edward saw it, not just her face, but the shape of it, the tilt of the chin, the way her fingers curled, exactly like Thomas's had. He saw a boy in her, but also a mirror of everything he'd buried, every regret, every what if. And still, she asked for nothing. No blame, no reparation, just a moment. To be seen, to be recognized. And in that moment, Edward wasn't a guard. He was a ghost of the man he had been, a medic, a friend, a mistake, wearing medals. His knees trembled, not from fatigue, but from memory and mercy. Because here she was, the child of a choice, not here to reopen a wound, but to remind him that it had never closed. No orders were given, no command was called, and yet, something happened. Clara stood, eyes lifted, the note still in her hand, the photo pressed gently to her chest. Edward moved, not with speed, not with force, but with purpose. His boots shifted, a pivot, clean, precise, a motion drilled into him, now used for something entirely different. Not ceremony, but confession. He faced her, fully, and then he raised his hand, slowly, deliberately, one gloved palm, to his temple. A soldier's salute, but not to rank, not to royalty, to her. The silence was absolute. Not one breath, not one camera click. Even the wind seemed to pause, because the crowd knew. Somehow, they knew. This was not for show. This was not performance. This was something older, deeper, a language without words. And in that single gesture, Edward gave back everything he had held. His shame, his silence, and most of all, his respect. Not just to the girl, but to the man he never stopped mourning. He stayed on one knee, not by rule, but by choice. And when Clara stepped forward, he didn't flinch. He let her close the distance. One small step, then another, until they were only inches apart. She looked at him, not as a guard, not as a stranger, but as someone who had carried a burden, like her. She reached into her coat, not with urgency, not with drama, just stillness, and handed him the letter, her father's letter, words he never got to say, words that had traveled through time, just to arrive here, at this moment, in this place, in these hands. Edward didn't read it. He held it, and then, for the first time in years, he bowed his head, not as a soldier, but as a man who had run from memory, a man who now understood. Some silences protect us, others become prisons, and this one had lasted long enough. They never spoke, not Edward, not Clara, not even Arthur, because sometimes words are not the bridge. Sometimes it's the silence, the shared weight, the unspoken understanding that not all wounds bleed. Some just stay open, quietly. Clara turned to leave. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her hand brushed the letter in Edward's palm, a gesture, software final, the kind a daughter gives when she knows it's not her grief to carry anymore. The crowd parted, slowly, and for once, they didn't reach for their phones. They didn't clap. They watched, because they had witnessed something sacred, a soldier's rule broken, not for glory, but for grace. Edward rose, not lighter, but clearer. And when he returned to his post, it wasn't ceremony, it was choice. He stood again, still, silent, but not the same, because now the silence spoke for him. And if you passed by and looked close enough, you might ask yourself, what would you have done if a little girl handed you the weight of memory? Some wounds don't need stitches. They need time and silence. We are taught to move on, to tidy the past, to bury what aches beneath routine and ritual. But the truth is this: not everything needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be faced. There is dignity in standing still, in bowing your head, not in shame, but in recognition. Recognition of what mattered, of who was lost, of what was never said. And maybe, as we age, we learn that the most courageous act is not to speak louder, but to listen, to memory, to consequence, to those small voices that waited patiently just outside the noise. So if you find yourself in front of someone who carries more than they say, pause, not to fix, not to rescue, but simply to be present. That, sometimes, is the greatest form of love we still have left to give.